There was no mercy in Dante Valenti's eyes when he watched Amara Bennett kneel before his entire family and accused her of betraying him. She tried to defend herself, but the Don had already made his judgment. Whatever tenderness had once existed between them meant nothing in that moment. He condemned her before everyone who mattered to him. And yet, 20 minutes later, Dante was carrying her unconscious body through his mansion, his arms tightening around her as he begged her not to die. Because the woman he had just condemned had been protecting him all along, and he had been too blinded by his own mistrust to see it. But to understand how Dante Valenti came to this moment, to understand how the woman he had condemned had become the one person he could not bear to lose, we have to go back to where it all began. Amara Bennett had arrived at Dante Valenti's mansion as nothing more than his newest chef. The house had a way of announcing its owner before he ever entered a room. Marble floors that swallowed sound, staff who moved like they were being watched because they always were. Even the air in the East Wing seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves understood that Dante Valenti did not tolerate carelessness. Amara noticed it within the first hour, the way conversations dropped when a door opened, the way a maid's hands trembled slightly as she folded linens, the way the head of security walked the halls like a man perpetually bracing for bad news. She had worked in enough kitchens to know fear when she saw it. This was not the ordinary anxiety of a demanding employer. This was something closer to reverence, laced through with the kind of caution people reserved for things that could hurt them. She met him on her third day, when he came down to the kitchen looking for coffee at an hour when no one else in the house was awake. He was larger than she'd expected from photographs, not just in height, but in the sheer deliberate stillness of him, as if every motion had been considered before it was made. He wore a black shirt open at the collar, sleep still clinging to the corners of his eyes, and when he looked at her, it wasn't the look of a man greeting his chef. It was assessment, cataloging. "You're new," he said. "I am," she agreed, already reaching for the kettle. "And you're the reason the last two chefs quit, apparently. Something about a man who sends food back if the salt's a gram off." A beat of silence stretched between them, long enough that the housekeeper hovering in the doorway went pale. Amara didn't look up from the stove. She had learned a long time ago that fear only fed on itself if you let it. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't a question. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't tasted my cooking yet. She set a cup down in front of him, black, no sugar, though he hadn't told her how he took it. "Give it a week. You'll be too busy enjoying dinner to remember to be intimidating." He didn't smile. Dante Valenti rarely did. But something in his dark eyes shifted, some flicker of interest he didn't bother to hide, and his gaze moved over her, unhurried, deliberate, taking in the soft weight of her curves beneath her apron, the fullness of her mouth, the confidence in the way she stood in a kitchen she'd occupied for exactly 3 days. It was not the look she was accustomed to receiving from men like him. Men like him usually looked past women who looked like her, toward the sharp, narrow silhouettes that populated magazine covers and society pages. Dante did not look past her. He looked, and he did not look away quickly enough to pretend otherwise. "We'll see," he said, and took his coffee upstairs without another word. It became a habit before either of them admitted it was one. Dante Valenti, who ate most of his meals standing over a desk between calls, who treated food as fuel rather than pleasure, began coming home for dinner. He told himself it was the food, and it was extraordinary, rich and unpretentious, the kind of cooking that tasted like it had been made by someone who understood that a meal could be an act of care. But it wasn't only the food. It was the 15 minutes before dinner when Amara talked to him like he was simply a tired man at the end of a long day, instead of the most feared name in the city. It was the way she rolled her eyes when he criticized a dish out of habit rather than genuine complaint. It was the sound of her laugh, unguarded and full, drifting down the hallway while he sat at his desk pretending to read contracts he wasn't reading. He noticed things about her that had nothing to do with her cooking. The way she hummed under her breath while she worked, the small, private smile she wore when she thought no one was watching, The particular grace with which she moved through a kitchen too small for her comfortably, never once apologizing for the space she took up in it. She, in turn, noticed him. She noticed that he rarely slept before 2 in the morning, that the light under his study door burned long after the rest of the house had gone dark. She noticed the faint shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of discipline could fully conceal, the way his jaw tightened when a phone call brought new bad news, the way he pressed his fingers to his temple when he thought he was alone. Nobody else in that house seemed to see him, not the man beneath the dawn, the exhausted, overburdened man who carried an empire on his shoulders and had no one to set any of it down for even for a moment. So she began leaving tea outside his study at night. Chamomile at first, then something more specific once she learned his tastes. A blend her grandmother used to make for restless nights, dried lavender and something warmer beneath it that she wouldn't name, burned as incense in a small dish she left outside his door. She never announced it. She never asked if it helped, but she noticed over the following weeks that the light under his door began going out earlier. He noticed, too. He noticed that someone in his house had been paying attention to him closely enough to know what he needed before he asked for it, closely enough to remember, and he knew without needing to ask who it was. It was a Tuesday, close to midnight, when he came downstairs for water and found her in the kitchen closing up for the night. Neither of them heard the other approaching. They rounded the same corner at the same moment and collided, her wineglass slipping from her hand and shattering against the tile. "I'm so sorry." She dropped to her knees to gather the pieces, and he crouched beside her before thinking, his hand closing over hers before she could cut herself on the glass. "Leave it," he said low. "It's fine, I've got it." Amara. Her name in his mouth stopped her cold. He rarely used it. To him, she was always you, or when he felt generous, chef. Hearing her first name in that quiet, graveled voice did something to her she wasn't prepared for. They knelt there a moment too long, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, close enough to see that his eyes weren't on the broken glass at all. They were on her mouth. Neither of them moved away. His hand came up to her jaw, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and she didn't. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle. It was the kiss of a man who had been fighting something for weeks and finally, catastrophically stopped fighting. She kissed him back with the same desperate lack of restraint, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt, and for a handful of seconds, the entire careful architecture of employer and employee, of Don and chef, collapsed into nothing but two people who had wanted each other for longer than either would admit. A door opened somewhere down the hall. They broke apart like they'd been burned. Dante stood first, jaw locked, and walked away without a word. Amara knelt on the kitchen floor amid the broken glass, her lips still tingling, and told herself it had been a mistake. Neither of them believed it. For the next 2 weeks, Dante Valenti became a master of avoidance. He took his meals in his study. He scheduled dinners out of the house that he had no real need to attend. When their paths did cross, his voice was clipped, professional. A wall thrown up so fast and so high that Amara wondered if she'd imagined the man who'd said her name like it meant something. She avoided him in turn, telling herself it was easier that way, that a man engaged to another woman had no business kissing his chef in a dark kitchen, that she had no business wanting him to do it again. But avoidance, she learned, did nothing to dull the awareness that crackled between them whenever they were in the same room. His eyes would find her across the length of a hallway and linger a beat too long before he forced them away. Her hand would brush his when she set a plate in front of him, and neither of them would move quickly enough to make the touch look accidental. The silence between them grew louder than any conversation could have been. It was nearly a month later when she brought the incense to his study, the way she had every night before. Except this time, he was awake when she knocked, and this time, he opened the door. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "You've been avoiding me first." Something in his composure cracked. He reached out and pulled her into the room by the wrist, and whatever restraint either of them had been clinging to for weeks simply gave out. He framed her face in his hands like she was something he was afraid of breaking. And when he kissed her this time, there was no interruption to save them from themselves. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her mouth, giving her the chance he hadn't given her the first time. "Don't you dare," she breathed and pulled him closer. What passed between them that night was unhurried, despite the hunger driving it. Slow hands and low voices. The particular reverence of two people who'd spent weeks pretending not to want this, finally allowing themselves to stop pretending. He touched her like he'd been waiting to learn every part of her, for far longer than either of them could admit. She met him with the same certainty, no hesitation, no apology for the body he'd been quietly worshiping with his eyes since the night they met. When it was over, he held her against his chest in the dark, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Dante Valenti fell asleep before 2 in the morning. He was gone from the bed when she woke. She found him downstairs an hour later, dressed, composed, every trace of the man who'd held her through the night carefully erased. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Financially, whatever you need. But I have an engagement to honor, Amara. This can't happen again." She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment she let herself want him. "I wasn't asking you to marry me, Dante," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "We're both adults. I didn't expect anything." It should have been a relief to hear her say it. Instead, something in his chest twisted painfully, watching her walk away without a single word of protest. He told himself it meant nothing to him. He told himself that for weeks, right up until the morning she failed to appear for breakfast because she'd been quietly sick in her bathroom for the better part of an hour. She counted the days after that with a mounting silent dread until there was no explaining away what her body was telling her. She went to the hospital on her one free afternoon, alone, and sat in a small examination room while a doctor confirmed what she already suspected. The timing left no room for doubt. She sat in her car outside the hospital for a long time before she could make herself drive back to the mansion. She knew Dante Valenti well enough by then to know exactly what would happen if she told him. He would take control. He would make decisions about her body and her child's future the way he made decisions about shipping routes and territory disputes, efficiently, unilaterally, without ever asking whether she wanted to be managed. She thought of the fiancé waiting in the wings, of the alliance Dante needed for his family's survival, of a child who would grow up as a complication in someone else's business arrangement, rather than a person who was simply loved. She could not do that to her son or daughter. She would not do it to herself. She decided to leave. Her resignation letter was 2 sentences long. When she handed it to him, he read it twice, as though rereading it might change the words. "Family matters," he said. "That's the reason?" "My mother needs help back home," she lied, and hated how easily it came. "It's time I went." He studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that he couldn't name. Whatever he was searching for, he didn't find it. Or he found it and refused to acknowledge it. "I'll have the paperwork ready tomorrow," he said finally, and turned back to his desk before she could see whatever was left of his face. He had no idea that the woman walking out of his office was carrying his child. He believed, with the particular arrogance of a man who had never had to chase anything in his life, that she was simply leaving. It did not occur to him that a woman like Amara did not run from things easily. It would be some time yet before he understood what he had actually lost. Isabella Conti had noticed the change in Dante long before the staff started whispering about it. She noticed that he came home for dinner now, when he had never bothered before her engagement to him was even announced. She noticed the way his eyes tracked the chef across a room during the rare occasions Isabella visited the mansion, a look he had never once turned on her in the 2 years of their arrangement. She noticed, and she filed it away with the cold, patient calculation of a woman who understood exactly what she stood to lose if this engagement fell apart. Not love. She had never expected love from Dante Valenti, but the name, the power, the unassailable position of being the wife of the most feared man in the city. It was one of the housemaids, eager for the favor and the money that came with loyalty to the future Signora Valenti, who told her what she'd seen. Amara Bennett, leaving Dante's bedroom in the early morning, her hair loose, her feet bare on the marble. Isabella's expression did not change when she heard it, but something in her had already decided that Amara Bennett would not be a problem for much longer. The opportunity arrived with Dante's tender for the Delacroix shipping acquisition, a proposal worth more to his family's legitimate business interests than almost anything he'd signed in a decade, its terms and figures locked in a single document he kept in his study safe. Isabella did not need to understand shipping contracts to understand leverage. She only needed the maid and the maid's willingness to make a copy. The altered version was nearly indistinguishable from the original. A handful of figures shifted, a clause softened just enough to gut the proposal's advantage without announcing itself. The maid entered Dante's study with the counterfeit document and replaced the original in his safe, then left with the real document and carried it down the hall, eventually tucking it, unnoticed, among the boxes Amara had already begun packing for her departure. Amara found it 3 nights later while sorting through what remained of her belongings, a folder that didn't belong to her, stamped with Dante's seal, containing figures she recognized instantly as far too important to have ended up buried in a chef's belongings by accident. She didn't understand the scheme behind it. She only understood with the sharp instinct of a woman who had learned to read a room the moment she'd arrived in that house that something was deeply wrong, and that if the wrong version of that document sat in Dante's safe when he needed it, it could cost him more than money. She didn't stop to think about what leaving her own room at that hour might look like. She carried the real document down the hall, slipped into his study while he was still downstairs, and switched it with whatever version currently sat in his safe, tucking the discarded copy beneath her arm as she left. Dante rounded the corner at the top of the stairs just as she was closing his study door behind her. Amara. His voice had gone flat, dangerous. What were you doing in my study? It's not what it looks like, she said, and even to her own ears it sounded exactly like what a guilty person would say. He crossed the distance between them and took the folder from beneath her arm before she could stop him, his eyes scanning the altered figures inside, figures he recognized instantly as wrong, as sabotage, though he had no way yet of knowing which version was the fake. All he knew was that the woman standing in front of him, the woman he had spent weeks not wanting to want, had just been caught leaving his study at midnight with a document that could cost him one of the largest deals of his career. Explain it to me, he said, each word carved from ice. Now. I found it in my room. I don't know how it got there. I was trying to fix. You were trying to fix it, he repeated, and the disbelief in his voice cut deeper than anger would have. You've been planning your departure for weeks. You handed in your resignation days ago, and now, conveniently, on the same week I have the Delacroix figures locked in my safe, I find you coming out of my study at midnight. Dante, please. Don't. The word landed like a blow. Whatever softness had existed between them in the dark of his bedroom was gone entirely from his face now, replaced by the cold, closed calculation of the man his entire empire feared. He had trusted her. He had let her closer than he had let anyone in 15 years, and his mind, already primed by his own guilt over how he'd discarded her, seized on the easiest explanation, that he had been a fool, that she had used the access he had given her, that everything soft between them had been a means to an end. The accusation was personal in a way that made it unbearable. He did not think she was some enemy's plant, some professional spy sent to unravel him. He believed the woman he had held through the night had looked at his weakness and used it against him. And that belief hollowed something out of him, even as his fury filled the space it left behind. He called his family together that same night, the capos, the household, everyone who nattered to the empire he ruled. He stood in the great hall with the altered document in his hand and looked at Amara like she was a stranger. She had access to confidential material, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, and used it against this family. Dante, I didn't. Her voice broke. She could feel every eye in that room fixed on her, could feel the particular horror of being condemned by the one person whose belief she had actually needed. She knelt because her legs would no longer hold the weight of the moment, not because he ordered it, though the order came anyway, cold and absolute, sending her out into the rain that had begun to fall against the tall windows, out onto the stone terrace where the whole household could watch her kneel in the cold and understand exactly what happened to people who crossed Dante Valenti. Inside, it did not take long for the truth to surface. One of the capos, reviewing the safe's contents to assess what damage had been done, noticed something Dante's fury had blinded him to. The figures in the document Amara had been caught with didn't match the terms Dante had approved weeks earlier. They matched an altered version. Someone pulled the household security footage without waiting to be asked twice, and there it was. Time-stamped 3 nights prior, the maid entering the study with the counterfeit document and leaving with the original. Then later, Amara's own entrance into the frame, not planting anything, but restoring what had been stolen, correcting a sabotage she hadn't understood but had recognized as dangerous all the same. Dante watched the footage twice, his jaw working, his hands braced against the desk, as the full weight of what he'd just done crashed over him. It was in the middle of that same frantic search, men combing through paperwork, trying to understand the full scope of what Isabella and the maid had done, when someone found the hospital paperwork among Amara's things, still packed for a departure she'd never explained. Dante's second-in-command brought it to him without comment, and Dante stared at the date on the intake form, then did the arithmetic without wanting to, and felt the floor drop away from beneath him. She hadn't been leaving because of a sick mother. She had been leaving because she was carrying his child, and she had been prepared to disappear and raise that child alone rather than ask him for anything at all. He was moving before he finished the thought, out through the great hall doors and into the rain, shouting her name into a night that swallowed the sound. He found her, collapsed on the wet stone of the terrace, her body finally giving out under the weight of exhaustion, cold, and the particular devastation of being condemned by the man she loved. Amara. He was on his knees before he registered moving, gathering her against his chest, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse, for breath, for any sign of life in the limp weight of her body. Amara, look at me. Don't you dare do this. He carried her through the mansion himself, refusing every offer of help, his arms locked around her like he could hold her together through will alone, shouting for a doctor, for warmth, for anyone who could tell him she was going to be all right. The household that had watched him condemn her only minutes earlier now watched him beg a God he didn't believe in to let her live. Watched the dawn of a city come apart in the middle of his own hallway with no attempt to hide it. I love her, he said. To no one, to everyone, his voice raw and unfamiliar even to himself. I never wanted the engagement. I never wanted any of it. I want her. I can't lose her. She woke hours later in his bed, warm, dry, an IV taped to the back of her hand, and Dante seated in a chair pulled close enough that his head rested against the mattress beside her, his hand wrapped around hers like he hadn't let go since he carried her inside. Dante, her voice was hoarse. His head came up instantly, and the relief that broke across his face was unlike anything she had ever seen him allow himself to show. You're awake. He pressed her hand to his mouth, his eyes shut, breathing like a man surfacing from underwater. I know about the document. I know it was Isabella, her and the maid. I've seen the footage. I know you were protecting me, and I stood there and let everyone in this house watch me condemn you for it. Dante. I know about the baby. His voice cracked on the words. I found the paperwork. Amara, I am so sorry. I spent so long finding every reason I could to convince myself that what I felt for you was a mistake, an inconvenience, something I could contain if I just tried hard enough. I told myself it was the engagement. I told myself it was business. None of it was ever true. I was afraid of how much I wanted you, and I punished you for it instead of admitting it. Tears slipped down her face, and he wiped them away with a gentleness that undid her completely. You believed I betrayed you, she whispered. I was looking for a reason not to trust what I felt. That's on me, not you. It will always be on me. He pressed his forehead to hers, his hand splayed protectively over the place where their child was growing, safe. I'm ending the engagement. Isabella will never set foot in this house again, and neither will the maid who helped her. I'm not offering you money to disappear this time, Amara. I'm asking you to stay, not because of the baby, because I love you. And I should have said it the first time I left my bedroom instead of letting you walk out that door believing you meant nothing to me. I never expected you to choose me, she admitted. A man like you? A man like me started coming home every night for a woman who never once asked him for anything, and it took nearly losing her to understand what that meant. He kissed her then, slow and certain, nothing left unsaid between them. Marry me, not as an arrangement, not for an alliance, because I cannot picture a version of my life that doesn't have you in the middle of it. She married him in the spring, in a ceremony far smaller than his position would have called for, because neither of them wanted a spectacle, only the people who actually mattered, and a promise spoken without a single hidden condition attached to it. Dante Valenti remained exactly the man his city feared. His enemies still went pale at the sound of his name. His men still lowered their voices and quickened their steps when he entered a room, still understood precisely what kind of consequences followed disrespect or betrayal in his world. None of that changed, and Amara never asked it to. But inside the walls of that mansion, something had changed completely. She was the one voice that could interrupt him in the middle of a call and be answered without a flicker of irritation. She was the one person who could tell him he was being impossible and watch him actually listen. She reminded him to eat, to sleep, to set the weight of his empire down for an hour at a time, and he let her, because she was the only person alive who had ever loved the tired man beneath the dawn, instead of merely fearing the dawn himself. And late at night, long after the house had gone quiet and the rest of the world had learned to fear him all over again, Dante Valenti still listened for one particular sound above every other. The soft, familiar rhythm of Amara's voice, calling his name from somewhere down the hall, and the certainty, finally, unshakable, that he would always come.